I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily, where once again immigration is our focus. Yesterday, we stayed up until the wee hours with Sam Coates, our deputy political editor, following the twists and turns of the vote on the Rwanda bill, in which, of course, Rishi Sunak was successful, the rebellion ultimately barely making it into double figures. The legislation now gets handed to the Lords, where the working assumption is they'll give it both a kicking and reconstructive surgery. So there will be, at the very least, a considerable wait before anyone is sent packing to Rwanda. Perfect opportunity, then, to focus on some Sky journalism. The government has been very quick to crow about its success in last night's vote. The Prime Minister held a news conference, which we will be discussing with Sam Coates just a little later. But even before last night's vote, Rishi Sunak was keen to give the impression that he was dealing with the asylum seeker issue. He and his ministers often making the claim that they were dealing with the backlog and reducing the number of so-called migrant hotels. However, our investigation suggests that in some instances, as hotels are closed, asylum seekers are simply moved to another hotel. In the studio, our communities correspondent, Becky Johnson, and communities producer, Nick Stylianou. Becky, what first prompted you to look into this?
The Home Office don't tell journalists where migrants are staying, which hotels they're in. So we're very reliant on local charities who tend to offer support to those migrants. And it was these charity workers have been saying to us for a number of weeks since this announcement that 50 hotels would close by the end of this month, close to asylum seekers, I should say, not close fully, that what's happening is they're getting just a few days' notice and then taxis turn up and in a lot of cases take asylum seekers to another hotel, which may be 70 miles away. And in some cases, actually, the people don't know where they're going until those taxis turn up. It's actually the taxi driver who tells them where they're going. It's causing a lot of upset because, of course, these asylum seekers have been, in many cases, waiting a very long time for their claims to be processed. So they've done things like enrol in colleges, for example, and to suddenly be uprooted means that opportunity for them is gone.
Before we examine exactly what is going on at the moment, Nick, just remind us why we are in this position, what the government's problem is with housing migrants in hotels. I mean, it comes down to money, of course, but ultimately the problem is it's one of their own creation, surely, this asylum backlog.
The reason these asylum seekers are in hotels is because they haven't had their asylum claims processed. We're not talking about people who've had their asylum claims accepted and have nowhere to go. That is another story in itself. We're talking about people who are waiting for a decision on their asylum claims, who are being put up in hotels, and the backlog is growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And the government likes to talk about eye-watering figures. We're talking about over £8 million a day.
Which is a chunk of change, but set against GDP, perhaps not the biggest figure in the government budget.
And this is across 400 hotels almost nationwide. And we're talking about hotels in city centres, budget chain hotels, but big chain hotels nonetheless, to rural hotels that you might see with maybe, a dozen rooms. And people are being put in 2-3 people per room. And those costs are mounting up. So what the government wants to do, naturally, is reduce those costs, consolidate some of those hotels. But where they say, hey, look, we've shut 50 hotels, they're not shutting those hotels and the people are then going into communities and having their asylum claims processed. What we found is, as Becky said, they're just being moved from hotel to hotel.
What is the point that they're trying to make? Is it that there is other accommodation that these asylum seekers can be put in, or that these people are illegal and they shouldn't be here in the first place, that kind of rhetoric?
You have to look back to when this announcement was made that they were going to close these 50 hotels. And that was back in the autumn of last year. And when they made that statement, it came with a lot of talk about eye-watering hotel bills. We want to move these people to cheaper types of accommodation. The Bibby Stockholm barge was talked about, as were former MOD facilities. So the impression given by the government was that they would be reducing hotel bills by moving asylum seekers to cheaper types of accommodation.
Yeah, makes sense if the accommodation is up to scratch and indeed if the accommodation actually exists.
Is there.
But look, I mean, I'm terrible at maths at the best of times. I mean, you've got a degree in maths, haven't you? But I can see that 300 hotels down to one barge and one RAF site in Essex is not achievable, even if you reduce 400 hotels by 50 hotels. The numbers just don't go unless you clear that backlog at a rapid rate. And to be fair, Rishi Sunak did come and say, we've cleared the backlog. We're very happy with that. The Home Office came out in the beginning of January and said, yep, we've cleared the backlog. And we're talking about what they define as legacy cases.
So that's people who arrived in the country before the end of June 2022.
But what we found actually is that that's also not true, right?
Tell us about that. In fact, you've spoken to someone who was one of those legacy cases.
It ties in with the Rwanda policy and all the political argument we've seen about that. It ties in with this announcement about hotels, and then we see the reality on the ground where people are actually going. And then we had this announcement earlier this month from the Prime Minister who said they've cleared the backlog. But the reality is, actually, not everybody has been processed. There are some outstanding cases. And just because people have been processed doesn't mean a decision has been made, a final decision on their case.
Okay, you're going to have to explain that one to me.
So, for example, Khan, who we met in one of the hotels, so he was being moved out of a hotel that was closing to migrants into another hotel. But he arrived before that cut-off point, so part of the legacy backlog, and he hasn't been processed. He's enlisted the help of a solicitor who was emailing the Home Office in December saying, well, my client hasn't heard. He doesn't know why, and they're not getting any answers from the Home Office. And actually, the charities that we speak to say he's not alone.
I'm not allowed to work. I can't do something.
And what is it you're studying?
I'm studying GCC Maths, or GCC of Maths, and also English Level 1.
And is that with the hope of getting a job?
Yeah, I must find the new college, everything, new friends, new environment. That will be very hard and terrible for me.
I mean, on paper, Khan, we should say that's not his real name, Khan shouldn't exist. His hotel's been closed, and according to Rishi Sunak, he's part of a backlog that's been cleared. But we see him in another hotel with an asylum decision that hasn't been reached.
And also, he doesn't want to be living in a hotel. He doesn't want taxpayers to be putting him up. What he wants is a decision on his asylum claim, which he hopes will go in his favour, so that he can earn money and pay his own way.
I mean, tell us just a bit about his background, because it's fascinating to me that this is someone who hasn't been just put through, as they say in Westminster, on the nod.
He was 18 when he came over, he's 19 now. He comes from Afghanistan. He told me that a lot of his family members worked for the Afghan government at the time of the Taliban takeover. And so, therefore, quite a number, he said, of his family members, including him, paid smugglers in the end to get them out of the country because they didn't feel safe. Now, he said when he paid the smugglers, he didn't actually know where he'd end up. He ended up on a small boat arriving into the UK. Now, there is another interesting part to his story, because he was, when he landed in the UK, taken to the immigration removal centre at Heathrow, where he witnessed a number of men being taken to get on that first flight to Rwanda back in June 22 that never took off. He's been in hotels ever since. And actually, there's even more cost implications. So one of the hotels that I witnessed close and the people move is in Worcestershire. Now, those men were moved up to Derbyshire, but some of them actually have quite serious health conditions that are being managed in the local hospital in Worcestershire. The hotels are usually managed by one of the providers that the Home Office pay to look after them. So in the case of the ones we've seen, that's a company called Serco. And so Serco have agreed that every time a medical appointment is needed, they will be transported by taxi 70 miles back to the hospital in Worcestershire and then 70 miles back. Everybody involved in this process says, is this really saving money? And that's why Hallo, one of the asylum seekers that I spoke to, he was very cynical, but he said that he doesn't really think it is saving money. He thinks that this is because of the election. He feels that he's been moved around from pillar to post because he thinks that the government would like to be able to say to the public, we're dealing with the issue of hotels.
How often are these people getting moved?
Some at the hotel that I witnessed closing had already been moved from another hotel a month earlier that had closed to this hotel.
With all the attendant costs involved in
Exactly.
And this isn't something that is willingly paid for out of the public purse to kind of say, oh, well, you have a hospital appointment, that's fine, but also you have college and you have this and you have that. They lose college places. We're talking about families losing school places because they're moved miles and miles away.
How's the money supposed to be coming down?
The truth is, it's not going to, is it? Because these people have to be accommodated somewhere. And, as we saw yesterday pictures, more and more people are coming every day without alternative, cheaper forms. We don't see any more barges on the horizon. We don't see MOD facilities being ready anytime soon. Then really the only alternative is hotel accommodation, and it does cost.
One of the plans is not only to have these asylum seekers moved onto former RAF sites because they've got the space, but also to put the processing facility there as well. Yeah. But that's taking such a long time. I mean, we can even see the Home Secretary himself even opposed in his own constituency one of these places. So you do wonder when it's actually going to happen.
We spoke to an immigration lawyer a couple of months ago, and she said all of these millions of pounds, all of these people with lives in limbo for 1, 2, 3 years, this could all be solved if these asylum claims were simply processed more quickly.
We were discussing this before we started recording. I mean, Rishi Sunak has somehow discovered 150 judges down the back of the sofa to deal with appeals. But where are the, goodness knows how many thousands are required, but the asylum processors that are ultimately, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the lack of them is ultimately why we are in this situation in the first place. And of course, people coming here in the first place as well. But if we were processing at a rate of knots, we wouldn't be spending 8.2 million quid a day on hotels.
I think it comes down to rhetoric versus reality. And the government wants the rhetoric to be tough. They know that voters want to hear that substantial things are being done to solve this, to save money. And so they make announcements, but we see the reality of how those policies are being delivered. And I don't think it's quite what was sold to voters or what voters think is happening.
So we have a Rwanda bill going through Parliament right now that even if it makes it onto the statute books, even if it doesn't get a kicking from the Supreme Court, if it actually proves that it works, we're talking about a handful of people this side of the election. But actually, your work and work of others shows people are getting pushed from smaller hotels into bigger hotels. Is there any of this from the government right now, Becky, that isn't pure and simple rhetoric? I mean, I'm looking at a picture of Rishi Sunak right now with Stop the Boats on the lectern, and I'm wondering if that is rather less a promise to the people of this country and more an aid memoir to him as one of the things he's got to actually get to grips with and do.
If his stated aim to stop the boats is to be achieved, then things that they do have to be a deterrent. And from the asylum seekers that I've spoken to, nothing that the government has announced or done yet seems to deter them. They don't think that they'll get sent to Rwanda. I am yet to meet an asylum seeker who regrets making that journey and getting into the UK despite everything that's going on with the Rwanda bill.
Nick, Becky, thanks very much indeed. Well, of course, Becky and Nick did ask the Home Office for a statement. This is what they gave us. We are making significant progress as we have already moved asylum seekers out of 50 hotels to reduce the cost of £8.2 million a day to UK taxpayers. As we exit more hotels in the coming months, we remain upfront about accommodation being on a no-choice basis. This means that individuals may be moved to other parts of the asylum accommodation estate too, including hotels. The statement concludes, we work closely with accommodation providers and local authorities to manage the exit process in a way which limits the impact on partners and service users alike. Stay where you are. We will be back in just a moment when I'll be speaking once again to our deputy political editor about Rishi Sunak and a certain news conference held a little earlier today. Back in a moment. Welcome back to a somewhat bleary-eyed edition of The Daily. The reason? Well, of course, the podcast team were up burning both the midnight oil and candles at both ends, covering the Rwanda vote in which the Prime Minister was ultimately successful. And so journalists were summoned to Downing Street this morning for a somewhat confusing news conference. He was with us last night. He's back with us again. Sam Coates, our deputy political editor. What did you make of the press conference then?
I mean, it was just bizarre, Neil. So the Prime Minister assembled the nation's top media in Downing Street. I was obviously back in our Millbank studio and proceeded to take them down a rabbit hole, which involved him essentially using the most famous lectern in the country to lecture the House of Lords on the necessity of passing the next few stages of the bill, which basically the emergency legislation that Rishi Sunak hopes will get planes off to Rwanda. But yes, Rishi Sunak did get the Rwanda bill through a vote in the House of Commons. It's only one vote in the middle of this big process. There are going to be lots more votes in the Lords and then back in the Commons. So we're by no means through this process. It's going to be months away before it even has a chance of becoming law. And when I heard that the Prime Minister was calling a press conference, I thought, aha, they are almost certainly going to change topic. They're going to start to pivot to the economy or something that might be better. But instead, the Prime Minister stood up and he essentially pleaded with peers to do what he wanted. I can let you into a secret. I don't think he's going to make the blindest bit of notice to his lordships.
No, really, seriously, that they're not going to listen to him in a news conference, a televised news conference from Downing Street, where he lectures them on their responsibilities as the upper house in a bicameral system.
Why address the public via the telly in order to get a message across to peers? The strategy here is fascinating, Neil, because a little bit of it reminds me of kind of Boris Johnson 2019, Boris against the establishment, where the kind of left and the judges and the, you know, all the forces of kind of sort of conservatism in a bad way, if you're Rishi Sunak, kind of the past, try and drag down bold reforming policies. But and if that's what he's trying to pull off, my God, he's going to find it difficult. You know, Rishi Sunak is not Boris Johnson. He is a much more establishment figure. He is a lot more conventional. He's about stability, not ripping things up. That's, you know, that was his job when he came in to Downing Street. He has David Cameron, Lord Cameron, as now one of the biggest figures of his government. So you can't optically say that you're against the House of Lords as well as being for it when it comes to your foreign secretaries. I don't know whether you've noticed, but, you know, year after year, the Tories have packed the House of Lords. So there are way more Conservatives in the House of Lords now than there are Labour. And really quite controversial legislation does get through. It takes a while and, you know, there's a bit of what's known as ping pong. And then it's like, well, what's the headline that they want out of this press conference? And there was nothing in the opening statement, you know, because, you know, Prime Minister lectures House of Lords is not exactly relevant to people's lives. So it came in the questions. It was Channel 4 and it was Daily Mail asked questions. And they said, so, Prime Minister, are we going to have any flights before the election actually take off? And there was a thicket of words that came out of the Prime Minister's eye, a veritable forest. But when trying to glimpse through the trees, it didn't sound like there was an answer.
But there isn't an answer.
But there has been an answer that he's been able to give in the past that he wasn't able to give today. So in the past, he has said we'll have flights before the election, or there'll be flights in the spring. And he didn't say it today.
But we know when the election is going to be now. That's the problem. And there is a finite amount of time. And he knows that there is every possibility that the parliamentary whiff-waff, phrase I came out with last night, and I'm holding on to that one. I mean, the parliamentary ping-pong means that, you know, even if it does get through, there will be a small amount of time which will no doubt be spent being challenged in the courts before anything happens.
The Attorney General and the legal officers say there's a 50-50 chance of this piece of legislation working in the courts. It's got to be tested in the courts, and they've got to use the new procedures to see whether whether there's a Strasbourg intervention from the European Court of Human Rights, and whether and kind of what happens when that happens, given the kind of changes that this bill. So we just don't know, and it's going to take time, and the electoral timetable is ticking, and what Rishi Sunak did today was to highlight the fact that he hasn't got this bill through yet by sort of pleading with peers to do the next bit. And every time you highlight that you haven't solved the problem, you cause yourself a political problem. And this has been the story of this week. You know, everyone arguing about a piece of legislation they haven't got through. And the consequence of that is clear to see in today's polls, where reform has popped up even higher than it has, because you've got a government going on about a problem that hasn't fixed, and the party that's saying we'll take a tougher stance looks like the one that's reaping the rewards.
Sam, simply put, do you think Rishi Sunak believes it when he stands up there and he lectures the Lords on their responsibilities? You talk about Boris Johnson as the anti-establishment figure in the fights that he picked. Do you think that Rishi Sunak is doing this for performance reasons or because he actually believes it?
I can't pretend to see into his head, but can I reframe the question slightly differently?
Of course you can.
Do I think that some of the smarter strategists around him suggested today's press conference Or does this feel like the kind of thing that Rishi Sunak thought would be a good idea himself and wouldn't listen to advice that it wasn't? So I don't know whether he believes it, but it felt so weird. Maybe it can only have been Rishi's own idea.
Sam, as always, thanks very much indeed. And that is your lot for today, but you can check out yesterday's edition of The Daily for that analysis recorded immediately after the Rwanda vote. And of course, Becky's story about migrant hotels available on our website and YouTube channels. We'll see you next time.